So if we are fine to start, I'm very happy to welcome our first speaker today in this parallel session. It's Husam Haj Omar from University of Oxford. So I'm very happy to welcome you here with us today. And I'm really looking forward to Husam's talk on ideology in translation of political discourse during the Syrian conflict. The abstract looked amazing, and I'm sure the talk will be the same. So Husam, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Emília, for the presentation and for introduction and for having me here. Okay, let me share my screen. So my talk today is about the ideology in the translation of political discourse during the Syrian conflict. So this study is part of a bigger study, really, that examines the translation of political discourse during the Arab Spring in general, not only the Syrian revolution. So in the original study, I examined the translation of political discourse in other countries like Tunisia, Egypt, Yemen, and Syria, of course, and from different angles. So from the angle of conflict or narrative theory, media, political discourse, and ideology. But in this study, I'm also examining the role of ideology in the translation of political discourse during the Syrian conflict in specific. So this paper is actually a critical discourse analytical study. It examines the role of ideology in translation and examines translation in media reporting of Syrian conflict, and it deals with political discourse in specific. Let me start with some theories, with some theoretical framework that I have chosen for my study. First of all, it's very important to examine or to investigate the role of translators as a reader of the source text to start with. So post-structuralists assert that signifiers and signifieds are constantly changing, which means that the sign or sign has become like a fluid entity whose meaning is not crucially determined, that's according to Roman. So which means that the text or the reading of the original text is not fixed, is really depending on the prior knowledge and experience of the reader of the text. And with the changing of the reader, we have a different interpretation of the text. This means that the intention of the writer is not valid anymore. So Perez, for example, thinks of a text as a separate entity whose meaning is determined by the reader, not by the writer, which leads us to the decline in the author's role in determining the meaning of the text. It's very important after that to touch upon the translator's role as an author, rewriter of the target text. Functionalists think that the translator is the producer of the text, which give them freedom in forming and creating the target text, freeing them from the restrictions imposed by the principles of loyalty to the source text and the intentions of the author. And this makes them in the lead of the decision-making process. And this simply means that the translation process has become a process of a rewriting of the text, depending on many factors, including, of course, the ideology of the translator, and also the authority of the patronage, which is a very important factor in determining the outcome of the translation process. So let's talk about patronage in relation to ideology. Lefebvre identifies three aspects of patronage: ideological, economic, and patronage of status. But for the purpose of this study, ideological patronage is really what we will examine here. So the patron, when we say a patron, we may mean the publisher or the publishing house, maybe the Ministry of Education in some countries, any party, any authority that have a say in or authority over the translation process. Okay, so this could mean a government authority that put some constraints and rules. It could be the publisher, as I said. It could be the editor. But it's not going to be the translator. So upon accomplishment, the translation is often overseen and edited by agents who work for the patron to ensure that the translation does not violate the cultural, ideological, social, or even religious values of the patron and or target audience. So this means that the patron now occupies the supreme position over the entire process, even has a more authority than the translators themselves. Okay, so we've covered the theoretical framework. Now let's move to the methodology that I've chosen for this study. So this study is a qualitative analytical study. It uses online data, and the event covered here, the Syrian conflict. And of course, the spatial settings would be Syria. The temporal settings would be from March 2011 till 2018. The data that I have chosen for this study consists of two main categories, which we will see later. So it's going to be the translations of one interview and 3 articles, and the data represents both conflicting ideologies. Okay. So it would represent pro and anti-Assad forces and affiliated media outlets. And for those who are not familiar with the Syrian conflict, Assad is the president of Syria, and there was a revolution against him. So this data represents both parties, the party or the media and even armed forces who support Assad, and the armed forces and representing media outlets who are against the regime, the Assad regime. Okay, so let me talk about the first category. So the first category, as I said, it represents anti-Assad forces and media. And the source text would be an interview by the Daily Beast with Zahran Alloush, who is late commander of Jaish al-Islam. We will talk about Jaish al-Islam later. We'll see who Jaish al-Islam is. The title of the interview is the rebel commander of Damascus, and Alloush here was interviewed by Hadil Owais. The target text is an Arabic translation conducted by Jaish al-Islam press office, and it was published by anti-Assad news outlet Orient News. So let's see who Jaish al-Islam is. Jaish al-Islam is an anti-Assad faction. It adopts an Islamist Sunni Salafist ideology, allegedly supported by Saudi Arabia. It fought against ISIS and Al-Nusra Front as long as the Assad forces. It was founded by Zahran Alloush, and he's now dead. He was killed by the Assad regime. The interview was translated by Jaish al-Islam press office, and the translation was published by anti-Assad Orient News or Orient Net media outlet. So now let's move to the second category of data, and this would be pro-Assad forces and media. I have 3 source texts, which 3 of them are articles published by Western journals. The first one is by Patrick Krappmann. It was published by The Independent on the 23rd of February 2014. The second article is by Adam Entus and Rima Abu Shakra. It was published by the Wall Street Journal on the 11th of December 2013. The third article is by Ian Black, published by The Guardian, 7th of November 2013. So these articles were actually published as reports on the website of Al-Manar, which is a Lebanese media outlet owned by Hezbollah. Okay, for those who don't know Hezbollah and they are not familiar with the work of Al-Manar, let me give you a brief introduction. Hezbollah is a Lebanese armed organization fighting alongside Assad in Syria. So it is in the opposite direction of Jaish al-Islam. Jaish al-Islam is, working against Assad, but Hezbollah supports Assad in Syria. Hezbollah adopts an Islamist Shia ideology. Okay, that's in comparison with Jaish al-Islam, which adopts a Sunni ideology. Okay, so Jaish al-Islam would be more closely affiliated with Saudi Arabia, while Hezbollah is ideologically affiliated with Iran, so the opposite direction. Hezbollah fought mainly against Syrian armed opposition and al-Nusra Front. It's led by Hassan Nasrallah. And the translated articles were published as reports, as I said, or parts of these articles were published as reports by Al-Manar. Al-Manar is the official media outlet speaking in the name of Hezbollah. Okay, I hope the explanation of the data and the background of the conflict is clear. It's just a bit, there's more into this, but I try to be brief for the purpose of this presentation as I have limited time. Okay, I'm not gonna go into like very detailed explanation of the data. I don't have much time, but I will cover some of the examples. Okay, so let me work on example number 4. So to remind you, this is an interview with Zahran Alloush, the leader of Jaish al-Islam, working against Assad. And so he was interviewed by Owais. And here the interviewer asks him a question. She says, why do many people call you a dictator? Okay, dictator. And what is the reason behind the demonstrations against you? Okay. Just to remind you, the translation was done by Jaish al-Islam's press office. So the translation would favor Zahran Alloush. Okay, and it was published again by an anti-Assad media outlet. Let's see the translation. Some people allege that Sheikh Zahran, a title was added here. In the original text, there's no title. Well, here there's more esteem or respect added to the figure of Zahran Alloush by adding a title to him. Is a dictator when it comes to criticizing him, which has brought him crazy enemies. So again, there is no mention of crazy enemies in the source text, and we see how the enemies were described here by saying they are crazy. So this is to undermine any opposition to Zahran Alloush. Is this correct? And who are the protesters against Zahran Alloush? From the way that the source or the source text was translated, we can see that there is kind of questioning of the identity of those people rather than the reason behind the demonstrations. Okay, so this gives you a clear idea of how the source or how the text was translated differently. Lots of interventions here, lots of additions, lots of omissions, lots of manipulation of the source text to present Zahran Alloush as a leader who has respect, and those people who are against him are crazy, and again questioning the identity of protesters rather than asking about the reason of the demonstrations. Let me move to another question, to another interview, to another extract actually. Okay, so just to remind you, Jaish al-Islam led a fight against Assad, but also against ISIS in Syria. ISIS was a bit more extreme than Jaish al-Islam, and Jaish al-Islam thought it's very important to eliminate ISIS. Okay, otherwise they wouldn't really be able to focus on fighting Assad, and ISIS had a major ideological conflict with Jaish al-Islam. So there was, a fight between both parties, Jaish al-Islam and ISIS, and Zahran al-Lush used that fight to legitimize the role of Jaish al-Islam and the image of Jaish al-Islam in the eyes of the West, okay, and showed them that, okay, we are the people who are fighting ISIS, which means we are moderate. We are not extremists. We are not, we are not against the West. We don't have a problem with the West. We are the people who are fighting ISIS inside Syria, which gives us legitimacy. So we'll see here. It's a question again by Owais, and we'll see the translation of that question. She says, "You fought ISIS in Ghouta, Qalamun, southern district in Damascus region, and in northern Syria. You lost many of your men. You lost many of your men." Let's see the translation of the particular sentence here. Of course, the translation is in Arabic, but I provided back translation. "You spent many months fighting ISIS and lost martyrs." So you lost many of your men in the source text, but in the target text, men have become martyrs. "In the cleansing war," adding intensity to the description of the conflict between ISIS and Jaish al-Islam. Again, emphasizing the question of, emphasizing the fact that ISIS is the enemy of Zahran al-Lush, the enemy of Jaish al-Islam, which means Jaish al-Islam is taking part of the war against ISIS alongside America. This means that Zahran al-Lush has a very important role inside Syria, which the West has to recognize. Again, which has caused a fierce attack against you by factions like Al-Qaeda and Jund al-Aqsa, emphasizing the enmity between Jaish al-Islam and Al-Qaeda and ISIS, generalizing Jaish al-Islam's experience and approach. Again, this is kind of adding more value to the role of Jaish al-Islam and the approach they follow. As much as against Assad. This is a very important part, reminding the reader that we don't only fight ISIS, we also fight Assad forces. And this is important for the legitimacy of Jaish al-Islam inside Syria, in the eyes of the Syrians themselves. So you see how many interventions in the text, how many changes that mainly aim to legitimize the role played by Jaish al-Islam and clear the image of Zahran al-Lush. So there are many examples, but I will also choose example 7, which is the title of the article of the interview, which is key here. So the original title says, "The rebel commander of Damascus, Zahran al-Lush, head of the Army of Islam, talks today to the Daily Beast about a 4-year siege, the future of Syria, and accusations that he is just another dictator in Islamic garb." Let's see the translation or the article or the title chosen for the article published by Orient Net. So it simply says, "Al-Lush, in an interview with an American newspaper, talks about democracy and the future of Syria." So in the source text, we have accusations, we have dictator, Islamic garb. In the target text, we have democracy, future of Syria. So it's really, everything has been changed. Okay, now in the second category of data, I've chosen 4 examples, but mainly, it's very difficult to go into details here. But if we check the examples, we will see that the Iranian-Saudi conflict is clear here. because obviously the translator works for Hezbollah, so they would aim to present Saudi in a very negative way, present Assad in a very positive way. Okay, so present Assad as the victor, as the party winning the war, presenting Saudi as traitors, as people or as a country who work for Saudi Arabia, for America, serving the American interests rather than the Syrian interests, and showing that the opposition inside Syria is actually losing the war. As we can see, Assad cannot deliver a knockout blow. So that's in the source text. On the target text, we see that the Syrian regime has now become more in control of the situation than ever since the beginning of the war. Okay, so there is different translation here. The winds of change that started in the Middle East are seemingly changing directions after the Geneva peace talks. So again, favoring Assad, present the Assad regime as the party winning the role, winning the war. Okay, that's important. Example number 10. The source text says the Islamic Front is a recently formed alliance of the target of the largest Islamist rebel groups that excludes the two main Al-Qaeda linked rebel groups, the Nusra Front and the Islamic State of Iraq and Sham. But in the target text, it says formed a coalition with, not excludes, with the two groups of Jabhat al-Nusra. Okay, this is an attempt by the translator, by changing that very little detail, but very important detail. It's an attempt to group the Islamic Front, which is the main opposition body inside Syria, with al-Nusra Front and ISIS. Al-Nusra Front is part of Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda and ISIS are classified as terrorist groups by the West, by America and by Europe. So again, this attempt to delegitimize the opposition and to link them to terrorist groups inside Syria. Again, here another example: non-jihadi Islamist and Salafi units. Of course, here they talk about Jaish al-Islam, and in the source text it describes Jaish al-Islam as non-jihadi. Okay, but in the target text, which is produced by Hezbollah, it says armed Islamist and Salafist groups. It doesn't mention non-jihadi. Of course, non-jihadi would be a positive attribute here. Okay, when you say non-jihadi, but the target text producer has chosen to delete that word again to delete any positive attributes to the opposition inside Syria. Okay, so let me list the findings and conclusions. Number one, the influence of ideology on translation is strongly manifested in the translation produced by Jaish al-Islam's press office of Zahran Alloush's interview with the Daily Beast. The role of patronage represented by Orient News, which published the Arabic translation of Alloush's interview in determining of the outcome of the translation process, proves to be vital. The influence of ideology during the Syrian Revolution has also been manifested through translations produced by pro-Assad media organizations such as Al-Manar. Al-Manar's interventions in the translations of various articles are manifestations of an ideological conflict between Iranian-sponsored Hezbollah and the Saudis in Syria. Many tools have been used to manipulate the translation, such as omission, addition, substitution, paraphrasing, etc. This this study has demonstrated that media outlets often employ the strategy of subheading to influence the reader's interpretation and perception of the text in line with the media outlets' agendas and goals. These are my references, and these are references to data. I really hope that you enjoyed this presentation, and I'm open to any questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much for very interesting talk.
Sure.
I think it shows us how powerful words are and how powerful translations are. And I'm sure we will have some questions from the audience. So I would like to invite all of the colleagues who are watching us. In case you have a question, you can comment or ask the question in the chat, but also if you wanted to, we can start open discussion and you can just raise your hand on Zoom and join us. For now, we have a comment from Marie, thanking you for a great lecture, really informative.
Thank you, Marie.
And I absolutely agree. I'll give our audience some time. We have Mary Wardle. Mary, go ahead.
Hi, thanks. That was really fascinating. What I was wondering, because obviously you're talking about the current situation, but before the recent situation evolved, what was the tradition of reported translated journalism like? Did it have a similar sort of, let's call it domesticating or censoring aspect, or was it perhaps more sort of balanced, would you say, if that's the right term?
You mean by the Syrian authority?
Yes. So, I mean, what's the population used to? I mean, that's what I'm asking. Mm-hmm.
Obviously, the interventions would be intense during the conflict, and that what happened. Before, I mean, Syria hasn't really witnessed, hasn't had any freedom of speech or free press since 1963. So it's been a very difficult for the work of press in general. And of course, the state had the upper hand, controlling the media, controlling the translation process of even novels and stuff. So there was a very strong control by the state over everything in Syria. But people didn't really care at that time. We would watch news and we know it was fake. And there would be some, false translations of false events. And people didn't really care, because at that time, people were more interested in business, more interested in their personal lives. But since the revolution started, people became more aware and more, attentive to details. And the state has become more fierce in controlling everything, shutting mouths and trying to intervene every aspect of life, including the translation of media. And the media outlets supporting the regime became more active in actually manipulating the translation process in general. So this has become more frequently done since 2011.
Okay, thanks. Thank you.
Thank you.
If we have any other questions, please go ahead. But I would have one question myself, if I may.
Of course, Emília.
I'm quite, of course, this is ideological and political issue, and your work was really, I'm looking forward to read more later in future. But very interesting is also the aspect of professional ethics. And I would just like to ask you, out of curiosity, what are the reactions of the professional community, of people from journals, from newspapers, of people who are professionals in informing someone? Because as you said already, this can be spotted. But is there also some professional debate when talking about the texts reflecting the political discourse? I mean, from our point of view.
Unfortunately, the academic atmosphere inside Syria, inside the Middle East, is not as active as it is in the West. Considering the political situation and considering the progress or the development of these countries. And since the beginning of the revolutions in general, many people really don't go to sources. They would read the target text, which would be a published interview or published article or something, unless it's a very important piece of writing. People wouldn't really check, and there is not much there's not much controversy around it. These pieces of text that I have, or these texts that I have chosen for my study, didn't really make any controversy at the time, because people didn't really check. Mm-hmm. So I have checked these texts. I've checked hundreds of texts. I've chosen those texts that I think are worth studying, because there have been major interventions. But I think if this happened in the West, this would create more professional debate than it is in the Middle East.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's indeed very interesting issue and interesting topic, and thank you for doing this important work, because that's where we see that our research work is really important also for the society and for reflecting the issues which are happening around us. And thank you for that, and for a great talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Emília.
And we will move on to our second speaker. I believe we have Marie here with us. Okay. Hi, Marie, I would like to welcome you back to Translation Interpreting Culture, because Marie was joining us also at the very first year of the conference. And I'm very happy that she will be joining us at the conference also today. Marie Krappmann is from Palacký University in Olomouc, and she will hold a talk on paratexts and what the paratexts can teach us about translating Yiddish literature into Czech. So, Marie, please, the floor is yours.
Yes.
I am very sorry, if I just may add one comment for our Slovak viewers. You probably noticed we did have a problem with interpreters connecting to our forum, but from now on the interpreting is functional. So in case some of our viewers would like to follow us in Slovak, that should be a possibility now. Sorry for interrupting you, Marie, and now for real, the floor is yours.
Okay, I try to share my presentation. Can you see it now?
It's coming, okay, yeah.
Yeah. And how can you see it now? Okay.
Yeah, we can see it. And also, if you want to start the presentation, I think you can just press Shift and F5 and...
Mm-hmm. Shift F5. It doesn't function. But you can see it.
But we can see it,
well.
yes. So even if you follow the slides like this now, it's fine. Whatever is more comfortable for you.
Moment. Now. It's okay now, yes?
Yes, now it's perfect. Perfect.
So our section is called Translators as Navigators, and I will focus on a special type of navigation in the translated texts. I will deal with various ways in which paratexts in Jewish periodicals in the communist era interacted with Czech translations of Yiddish literary texts. It's in general my field of interest, the reception of Yiddish culture in Czech society. Why is this topic interesting? Yiddish, as you probably know, is a specific language derived from German dialects, which contains a strong Hebrew-Aramaic component and is written in letters of the Hebrew alphabet. On the one hand, it is a language strongly associated with Jewish culture and the Jewish religion, especially the Hasidic movement. On the other hand, since the 19th century, it has been associated with the leftist movement among the Jews. This implies the ambivalent status that this language had during the communist era. Within communist ideology, Judaism was seen as something suspicious and rather dangerous, which often led to tragic consequences. This is evidenced by the history of Jewish communities, not only in the former Czechoslovakia. And Yiddish was the language that truly embodied East European Jewish identity. For these reasons, if the translator and the editors decided to publish a translation of Yiddish literary text, it was necessary to comment on it in some way, justify the choice, introduce the author of the source text, preferably as a left-winger, etc. This is exactly the function of different types of paratexts. The vast majority of translations of Yiddish literature into Czech have not been and still are not published in books, but in periodicals, mainly Jewish periodicals. In my presentation, I will focus on the politically interesting period of the 1950s and 1960s. This period represented a time of serious changes in the former Czechoslovakia. As Alena Heitlinger, a Czech sociologist, stated, in that time, quote, "The Czech and Slovak Jewish community has been shaped not just by the Holocaust and by the Stalinism at large, but also by the very specific experiences of de-Stalinization, which eventually led to the Prague Spring of 1968. There is no direct counterpart to this experience in other parts of Eastern Central Europe," unquote. From a number of periodicals, you can see a list of them on the slide. I will focus mainly on two of them, in which the most translations of Yiddish literature were published, namely Věstník židovských náboženských obcí v Československu, a Monthly of Jewish Religious Communities in the former Czechoslovakia, a long title, and Židovská ručenka, the Jewish Yearbook or Almanac. A few words about both periodicals. Židovská ručenka, the Jewish almanac or yearbook, was and still is a kind of a literary almanac. It began to be published in 1954 by the Central Ecclesiastic Publishing House. From the very beginning, translated literature played a really important role in this periodical. Mainly Jewish German authors such as Leopold Komprat, Salomon Kohn, Hugo Salus, and others were translated. Translators of Yiddish literature concentrated mainly on the works of two authors, Sholem Aleichem and Yitzhak Leibush Perez. As the editorial archive as well as the sources for censorship have been preserved only in fragments, paratexts represent a valuable, albeit indirect, source of information. The second periodical, the presentation doesn't work now. I don't know why.
Probably it froze. It happens
Do
sometimes, but maybe if you try to turn it off and turn it on again, that might help.
Hello?
But we can see the slides changing.
Can you hear me?
Yes, can you hear us, Marie? Marie, I think Marie might have some problems with connection. Can you hear us? Can you hear us, Marie?
Can you hear me? I leave the meeting and I try to, we can hear you, okay. So I will share the presentation again. Okay. I apologize. So now, the second periodical The Monthly of Jewish Religious Communities in Czechoslovakia was published between the years 1945 and 1990. This monthly was the most important Jewish periodical in the former Czechoslovakia. In the turbulent 50s and 60s, several tendencies can be observed in the presentation of Yiddish culture and Yiddish literature. In the numbers up to 1952, there is a relatively large number of articles on Yiddish culture and language, especially in the section called Briefly Behind the Dot, krátce za tečkou, that contained short articles reporting on world events. Between 1953 and 1955, the scope of the periodical was drastically reduced. The section called Briefly Behind the Dot disappeared and the number of articles about Yiddish decreased. This tendency was undoubtedly related to developments in the former Soviet Union and so-called Night of Murdered Poets, in which several leading figures of Yiddish cultural life were executed. The process with the alleged anti-state conspiracy center headed by Rudolf Stransky in former Czechoslovakia also played a crucial role in this development. In 1956, a section called From Around the World, Ze Světa, was introduced, which again included news about Yiddish more often. Translations of literary texts also began to be published, especially short stories by Sholem Aleichem and Yitzhak Leibush Perez. In the 6th issue from 1962, the first advertisement for the Soviet periodical Sovjetisch Heimland was published. References to this periodical then appeared regularly. But I can deal with the presentation. I can't go to the next slide. Where is the problem? I will do it so, yes. You can see it this way as well, yeah? Okay. On the slide, you can see the tendencies I have just described, illustrated by numbers. Yiddish literature into the editors often included reports of translations of Yiddish literature into other languages, sometimes very exotic. In the 15th issue from 1963, for example, Czech readers are informed about translations of 30 Yiddish titles into Chinese. The readers were also regularly informed about the translation of Yiddish books into Romanian, Russian, Italian, Japanese, even into Uzbek. Translations of Yiddish literature into Czech printed in the monthly Věstník were mostly accompanied by paratexts. We will take a closer look at their functions in a moment. One of my intentions is to answer the question of how paratexts in the almanac and in the monthly navigated the reception of translations of Yiddish literature in that times. Literature published in periodicals is accompanied by a slightly different type of paratexts than literature published in books. Therefore, I would like to specify briefly at this point what definition of the term paratext I will use and what types of paratexts I will deal with. My analyses will be based on the Genetian definition of paratext, which Annika Hockenberger reformulated for new media research. The term paratext denotes those objects in this definition that are in supporting serviceability, the German term is unterstützende Dienlichkeit, related to a primary reference object, to the text, and are more or less expressly authorized in this function. Since such a definition would be too broad for my purposes, I will rely on the definition of so-called peritexts. With regard to book production, the peritext is distinguished from the so-called epitext by the criterion of spatial proximity. Peritext is printed within the same volume, epitext is published outside the material unit of the book. However, since I will not deal with book production here, I will allow myself to adapt the terminology to the researched material. Therefore, as a starting point for my analysis, I will use the definition developed by the research group of the University of Bochum that focuses on the functions of paratexts in periodicals. So in their conception, peritext is understood much more narrowly as title, genre, so what Genet calls accessoire. Paratexts are defined as the direct framework of the text that is currently being read. So I will now quickly move from the definition to practice and explain what types of paratexts I will deal with. Depending on the location, these are paratexts occurring in close proximity of the literary text to which they relate, or paratexts which are loosely related to the central text and do not directly frame the text. And finally, paratexts relating to a text that is printed elsewhere, not in the periodical. Depending on the thematic criterion, several basic types can be distinguished, as you can see on the slide, if you can see it on the slide. So, you can see probably 3 samples on the slide. In the first picture, translations of 3 poems by David Edelstadt are immediately accompanied by a relatively long paratext, which is directly related to the life and work of the author. The title already guides the reader in a certain direction. Poet of the Jewish Proletariat, David Edelstadt is the title. The second example with the title in English, Eternally Young Perez, a fighter for progress and freedom, is a paratext spatially and thematically separated from short stories that are printed elsewhere in the periodical. The third example is a paratext relating to a literary text which was published elsewhere than in the given periodical. Okay. My analysis of paratexts will be based on the following thesis. First, I assume that especially in challenging social political situations, paratexts take on formative functions. One of the main functions is to legitimize the literary text chosen by the editors. The strategies used by the authors of the paratexts in this legitimation are in turn reflected the way the reader interprets the text. And in some cases, correlations can be traced between the ideologies presented in the paratexts and the choice of translation strategies. We will now have a look at some relevant functions that paratexts accompanying translations of Yiddish literature performed in the turbulent times of the 1950s and 1960s. I will focus mainly on various strategies aimed at influencing the reception of the central text. One of the key functions was the adaptation of the author's characteristics to the appropriate ideological profile. As an illustrative example, I hope you can read it in the presentation. As an illustrative example, let's take a closer look at the paratext accompanying a short story by Yitzhak Perez with the title Mlčenlivý bonze, the silent bonze. The story about a simple man completely surrendered to his fate and God's will has often been interpreted in the context of communist ideology as a biting criticism of the capitalist regime. The personality of the author, Yitzhak Perez, has been characterized in accordance with this interpretation. In this characteristic, Perez is primarily, quotation, a fighter against the regressive and outdated ways of Jewish life, meant is religious life. For example, the fact that he was the first Yiddish writer who was able to appreciate the importance of Hasidic religious literature is overlooked, as it would not correspond to the appropriate profile of the author. The authors of the paratexts sometimes describe anecdotes from the life of the author of the source text, which are intended to illustrate his ideologically correct attitude. In the first issue of 1956, for example, an anecdote from the life of Yitzhak Perez is included. This anecdote, you can see the point of the anecdote on the slide. This anecdote takes place at a ball in Vienna, organized by Viennese Jewish students. While all Viennese students come in gala attire, working class delegates from Galicia, Bukovina, and Romania arrive in, quote, simple belted blouses according to Russian custom. unquote. The Viennese organizers refuse to let them in, but Perez reacts as stated in the quotation. I will summarize it briefly. The writer, Perez, takes one of the workers to his hotel room, exchanges the clothes with him so that the working delegate is dressed in a festive suit while Perez is wearing work clothes. Finally, they return to the ball where the situation immediately calms down when the Viennese students see the great Perez in work clothes. This anecdote depicts Perez as a staunch defender of the poor working class and an opponent of all snobbery, which he was in a sense. The choice of texts to be translated largely met this characteristic. It was mainly Perez's short stories on socially critical topics that translators and editors choose to translate and publish. These corresponded to the author's profile created in Paratexts. In contrast, the stories from the Hasidic environment for which Perez became famous worldwide were not included in the monthly almost at all. The paratexts of the time justify often inappropriate biographical facts as well in the life of the author of the source text. For example, in the paratexts accompanying the translations of Sholem Aleichem's short stories, we find attempts to excuse his emigration to America. In the passage you see on the slide, Sholem Aleichem is portrayed as a victim of unrealistic, false lures of the capitalistic society. In a similar way, the authors of the paratexts of this period often had to justify other works by the author of the source text which did not fully correspond with the ideas of suitable literary production in an optimist communist society. For example, Itzhak Leibush Perez's later works, in which he sensitively portrays Eastern European Jews, were labeled as the result of his mental indisposition, of his mental depression. In some cases, even the central theme of the short story that the translator chose to translate had to be justified in the paratexts. One of the themes that often needed to be justified in the paratexts accompanying translations of Yiddish literature was the life of the religious Hasidim in the shtetls. This is the case, for example, in the paratext accompanying the translation of short stories Kasrilevka Tramvaj and Kasrilevka Hotel. The translation of both short stories was published in Jewish Almanac under the title The Visit in Berdichev. In a collection of short stories from the partially fictional town Kasrilevka, Sholem Aleichem describes the everyday life of Eastern European Jews, especially Hasidim. In the paratext accompanying the translation of this short story, it was therefore necessary to emphasize that Hasidim belong to the proletariat and that Sholem Aleichem does not actually write about the religious Jewish life in the shtetl, but about the life of the proletariat. You can see this on the slide. Another frequent strategy was to present the translated text as a suitable metaphorical illustration of political events. In the 9th issue of the Almanac of 1963, a translation of The Fable in Rhymes by the Romanian Yiddish writer Eliezer Steinberg was published, entitled The Bionet and the Needle. In this fable, two personified objects, a bayonet and a needle, argue over who is more useful to the world. It is the needle that wins the argument and laughs at the bayonet and in the last verses. A quote, I make a shirt, a sleeve, a dress, a hem, but people you can pierce forever, what will you create from them? Unquote. The author of the paratext relates the point of the fable to the current political event, namely the Moscow Agreement of the three major powers, as it is literally indicated in the paratext. What is meant is the nuclear test ban treaty signed in Moscow on August 5, 1963 by the United States, the Soviet Union, and the United Kingdom. The author of the paratext suggests a direct parallel between this historical event and the point of Steinberg's fable, quote, The Moscow Agreement could even be the dawn of a time when all mankind would look at the armed forces like a wise needle in the instructive yet humorous fable by Eliezer Steinberg, a Romanian Yiddish poet. So, the search for correlations between the contemporary political context and leitmotifs in translations of Yiddish literature is one of the very common strategies in paratexts of that time. Of course, the paratexts accompanying the Czech translations of Yiddish literature in the examined corpus performed much more functions than I demonstrated here on the basis of examples. In my presentation, I focused mainly on strategies in paratexts which served to influence the reception of the published translation and to justify the translator's choice. In selected examples, I intended to show how it was possible to influence the basic attitude of the reader towards the author and the translated text. In this context, I tried to briefly point out how a certain ideology can influence basic translation strategies. The content of paratexts in the research period suggests that the loosening in the period of de-Stalinization is in some degree reflected in the paratexts. You may have noticed that most of the examples discussed here date from the late 50s and very early 60s. Thus, it would certainly make sense to focus on, in more detail, on other lines of diachronic development of the paratexts and accompanying translations of Yiddish literature, as well as on more complex structural issues. I will try to do this, I hope, in the next months. So thank you for your attention, and excuse, please, the technical problems.
Thank you very much, Marie. Let's see if Marie can hear us. Can you hear us, Marie? Okay, so I think it's fine. I think the problem for Marie still continues, but we could hear her. So thank you very much, Marie, for a great talk. Well, this is a mystery, but I would like to invite our audience, in case they have some questions, please write your questions in chat. You can send them to everyone or directly to Marie, and Marie will respond. So thank you, Marie, very much. And now we can move to our third speaker, Mary Wardle. Mary, you can join us. I hope Mary can hear us and everything works. Everything's fine, yeah?
Okay, you can hear me?
Wonderful.
Okay.
And you can hear me, yes? Okay, good. I would like to welcome Mary Wardle, who is from Sapienza Università di Roma. And I am very excited about the topic of Mary's talk, because Mary will be talking about translating the body and embodiment and dense notation. So Mary, the floor is yours, and I hope everything works well.
Okay, so you can see the screen, okay, with
Yes.
the presentation, great.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Thanks to the organizers and my fellow speakers, and of course to the interpreters. And just to say, I'll be reading my paper, which is very similar to the one that I sent you. There's a few little bits that I've cut out to stick to the 20 minutes. So hopefully I'll manage. Okay, so yes, so there's been much academic interest in recent decades in what is called embodied cognition. So how embodiment, which here I'm defining as having, being in, or being associated with a body, contributes to mental phenomena, suggesting that meaning is grounded in mental representations of perception, emotion, and crucially movement. And the repercussions we can see, again, in the last 10, 15 years have been investigated in language acquisition, and in particular second language acquisition, but also in fields such as philosophy and psychology. Over a similar period of time, the figure of the translator as a flesh and blood human being has also come into increasing focus in translation studies, with research on the lives of individual translators, attention to their archives, interviews on professional activity, work environments, trade unions, professional associations, etc. So if we bring the two together, we can see how from gestures to sign language, our actual physical bodies are implicated in the production, reception, and of course, translation of meaning. Eye tracking in subtitles, lip synchronization in dubbing. In the language that we use to describe the translation process itself, we find constant references to the physical dimension, whether it be metaphors inspired by cannibalism on the one hand and reproduction on the other, or descriptions such as this, taken from an article by Primo Levi, who's describing here what he feels as the bodily aggression, the violence of being translated. So his book's moving from Italian into other languages. And you can see the words that I've highlighted, sort of he feels as though he's being x-rayed, castrated, planed, raped, embellished, and murdered. So this paper focuses on the practice of dance notation and how physical movement can be translated into a written document and subsequently transition back from notation to movement and ultimately performance as a way of investigating the intersection between translation and physicality. And just as in any other form of translation, notation offers varying degrees of possible interpretation. Again, there's no straightforward question of content A becoming content B, and as such can be an ideal start for exploring the embodied quality of translatorial activity. If we follow Raymond Jakobson's famous tripartite definition of translation, then most classical ballet, but this would be true of any form of dance, can be viewed as intersemiotic, representing as it does a choreographed kinetic interpretation of some earlier text. If we take the example of The Dying Swan, a ballet that came about in 1905, after Anna Pavlova asked dancer and choreographer Mikhail Fokine to write a short pièce d'occasion for her to perform at a gala. Alfred Lord Tennyson was extremely popular at the time in Russia, and Pavlova would have read his poems in translation. And inspired by one of his poems, The Dying Swan, and her walks in the park, she wanted the dance to represent a swan. Fokine proceeded to write the piece, setting it to Le Cygne, a piano and cello composition from the Saint-Saëns suite, Le Carnaval des Animaux. Pavlova went on to perform the ballet herself thousands of times, and it has become a set piece for dancers of all nationalities ever since. Its cultural legacy can be detected in the reference that Ogden Nash inserts in his 1950 poem, but also, we might say posthumously, in the way that many dancers, even today, choose to incorporate certain features of The Dying Swan into their interpretations of Swan Lake, a ballet that was choreographed 30 years before Fokine's choreography. So from this brief example, we can see how many acts of creative expression can be woven into the intertextual fabric surrounding one dance. But of all the texts mentioned, the only ones for which we have easily accessible, tangible records are the literary texts and the musical scores. The choreography doesn't fare quite so well. So, more or less improvised practices of dance notation, graphic, iconic, symbolic documentations of dance and movement, date back to the 15th century in Europe, with famous choreographers such as Raoul Feuillet, who published his choreography in 1700. Here on the slide, I'm afraid the date is wrong, it should say 1700. This work was very popular and translated throughout Europe. And at the time, most head and body movements would have been standardized and known by heart. So Fouillet's book only transcribed the footwork and the patterns that the dancers traced on the floor. But with the Dying Swan, Fouquin was creating a new kind of dance, what came to be known as the ballet russe. They were dances of the whole body, as he describes them, and not only of the limbs. He was interested in the significance of plastic expression and sought poetry in the movements. So he wanted to convey the expressive quality of dance. Around the same time, Nijinsky developed his own system based on the Stepanov notation that was used in St. Petersburg by the Imperial Dance Academy. He used it to notate his choreography of L'après-midi d'un faune, a bold enterprise, since, as in the case of Fouquin, the movement patterns of faune depart so radically from all the elements of classical style, which had up until then been so codified and therefore more straightforward, relatively speaking, to notate. And it's precisely because of these innovations of style and expression in dance in the opening decades of the 20th century that two new notation systems were developed and to varying degrees are still used today. Laban notation that you can see here on the left was devised in 1928 by the highly influential Hungarian dance theorist and choreographer Rudolf von Laban. And I noticed that his name is mentioned in the abstract for the audio description workshop tomorrow. In fact, there are a few sort of overlaps between the two topics. And this is arguably the most widely used system still today, especially in the States. Benesch movement notation, on the other hand, was developed in 1955 by Joan Benesch, a British dancer with the Royal Ballet, and her husband, strangely also called Rudolf, and is still used today by the Royal Ballet in the UK and the Royal Dance Academy, and as well as a number of other European companies. So I'll try to give you a brief idea of how these systems work using Benesch because it's slightly more intuitive. So as you can see from the image on the right, the notation is carried out on a 5-line stave. So you can use regular music paper where each line corresponds to different heights. So the floor, the height of the knees, the waist, the shoulders, and the head. And because movement develops in 3-dimensional space, there are different symbols indicating whether hands and feet or arms and legs are in front or behind the body. So you end up with images like this. If you look at the picture on the right, which is the classical 4th position, and the corresponding notation underneath, you can see how the left foot is notated as being behind the body and the right foot to the front. While the image directly to the left shows you the pointe position with the foot, the symbol, the little line at the bottom is here is above the line, showing that the foot is in the pointe position. Progression develops from the simplest of examples to the more intricate. And the system is capable of recording flexion, extension, rotation, direction, and level, traveling, change of support, absence of support, balance, loss of balance, the relationship to the environment. And each of these elements in turn has subdivisions. And so the various possibilities of which are combined to produce movement sequences. So the notation can convey rhythm and phrasing, patterns of movement with groups of dancers, support of one person by another, contact with objects, contact with the ground, with dancers sitting, lying, kneeling, etc. So it can represent everything from the exact angle of a finger to an overall pattern of dance. So here again in Benesch notation, we have the musical score at the top followed by the movements here notated for a group of 4 girls and 2 boys. And then there's another group of 4 girls and 2 boys doing something different, and a third group doing something different again. And the bottom line that you can see here are the sort of traces of their position across the various parts of the stage. So as well as covering all forms of dance, ballet, jazz, contemporary, ballroom, folk, etc., notation also has great potentialities in other fields, such as physical education. Here you can see the Benesch notation at the bottom for running and hopping. It's used in neurology, physiotherapy, ethnology, and copyright, where the notation is used for the correct attribution of original choreographies. In fact, in all fields where the precise recording and analysis of human movement patterns is important. And the field of study, the scientific and aesthetic study through notation of all forms of movement, is known as choreology, a universal kinetic language. So Laba notation, as you can see, also uses abstract symbols to represent the body, but disposes them, it's developed in sort of column-like patterns rather than the vertical development of Benesch. Neither of these systems represents the dance in a mimetic fashion. It's important to stress that both transcribe the experience of moving or positioning, rather than illustrating what the dancer actually looks like while performing. So the symbols are not artistic impressions of the dancer's body. They can be considered, to all intents and purposes, a new language with its own grammar and syntax. So this to give you a condensed idea of how notation can work. A much more complex question is what should be notated. So typically dance survives through its instantiation. Through being performed repeatedly, it has the potential for a dynamic existence, ever changing, but capable of living through those changes. And this repetition, however, requires that the identity of the work be established, which begs the question as to what exactly constitutes the identity of a dance. Just as with productions of Shakespeare, spoken in present-day English, for example, or staged in modern settings with contemporary costume, so with dance, there is some discussion as to what constitutes the core of the work. What has to remain the same and what can be changed for Swan Lake to still be Swan Lake? Is it the narrative, the bravura steps, the costumes, its division into acts, the way it combines with the music? Historically, classical ballets have been transmitted from one cohort of dancers to the next through a combination of oral and gestural traditions, who somehow, tradition, through the figure of the répétiteur or stager. And here you have a photograph of one of the Balanchine répétiteurs, or répétitrices, maybe we should say. Often former dancers themselves, who somehow channel the wishes of the original choreographer. For some, one of the drawbacks with this, however, can be the apparently idiosyncratic interpretation of what constitutes the text to be transmitted, and also that sometimes the continuity of memory can be lost if the ballet is not staged for 2 or 3 generations. It's important to remember that unlike literary translation, dance notation operates in both directions, as it were. The dance is notated into a written score, either at the time of its inception or later, and then subsequently the same score becomes the source text for returning to the original dance steps, giving rise to a new set of problems. The choreographer or notator may no longer be around. The dance company and the soloists may no longer be the same. The stage on which the dance is to be performed may be larger or smaller than that used initially, and so on. Joan and Rudolf Benesch acknowledge that there may have to be changes due to physique and temperament. The personality of the performer or current fashion go beyond the scope or purpose of notation. Fouquin himself wrote about his transcription of The Dying Swan. The execution may be more lyric or more dramatic. I admit both interpretations, and I leave to the performers to follow the course with their individuality, which their individuality dictates. But in modern times, why not simply film choreography? One answer is that although video is useful to examine a particular dancer's performance, and indeed many choreographers film especially their rehearsals, if not the actual performance, today most major dance companies rely on both video and choreology to accurately stage the classic repertoire on the one hand and preserve the originality of new ballets on the other. From a practical point of view, notation can indicate information which cannot be captured by the visual recordings, so grips and positions of hands or parts of the body that are hidden by other dancers, for example. The primary failure of filming, however, is that it is a recording of one particular performance and thus contains the quirks of individual performers and possibly errors. As Nelson Goodman stresses, the written record has the logically prior office of identifying a work. And as one notator puts it rather more pragmatically, would you hand a recording of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony to a musician, expecting them to learn their part in the orchestra by listening to it? Or would you ask an actor preparing Hamlet to learn the role, the words, the intention behind those words from a DVD of Mel Gibson's version? The parallels with literary translation are clear. One single original and many possible translations. We've all seen examples like this, where style can vary wildly, or where we can talk of variation on a theme. Goodman again, he's talking about a musical score, but we can apply what he's saying to a dance score as well. A score need not capture all the subtlety and complexity of a performance. The function of a score is to specify the essential properties a performance must have to belong to the work. The stipulations are only of certain aspects and only within certain degrees. All other variations are permitted, and the differences among performances of the same work are enormous. So to conclude with some of the wider implications within translation, in thinking about how to translate movement within the relatively conventionalized context of dance, there are clear implications also for integrating the body and its movement in other contexts, where language, words, are often the focus of the translator's attention. How to include non-verbal communication in interpreting, for example, how to translate the body in audio description. Issues of subjectivity, identity, mortality, spirituality are often centered around the physical bodies we inhabit, while contemporary debates such as body shaming, transgender rights, and Black Lives Matter all stem from the values inscribed in our physical identities. Questions of meaning, equivalence, interpretation, variation, and translatability have long preoccupied the academic field of translation studies. Approaching all this through the prism of the transfer from dance to notation and back, encoding movement, integrating the physical alongside the linguistic and the cultural, provides a challenging and hopefully stimulating addition to the ongoing debate. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mary. I mean, wow, that was very interesting talk indeed, and I think we had a chance to learn so much, and you raised so many questions probably for all of us really when we are thinking about translatability and when we are thinking about subjectiveness in translation. So I would just like to go on and listen to you for longer, but let's see whether our audience has any questions. In case you have any question, you can either send it in a chat, or you can just raise your hand on Zoom and ask Mary directly, whatever feels more comfortable for you. I'm looking at all of the participants so that I don't miss any hands. Maybe everyone is getting a bit hungry because we are moving towards lunch. But Mary, I would like to ask you, because this is very interesting for me, really, if I just think about the whole process of the dense notation, I think this is something where there is a lot of potential for research, but also when we look at it from practical point of view and where it can be applied. I know you were focusing on ballet, but I am thinking a lot about the new approaches to sign language, artistic interpreting of theater. And well, this would be very interesting to look at it also from this point of view. So I just actually wanted to ask whether you have any knowledge that this can be applied maybe in other contexts than maybe the general traditional ones we would think of.
Yes, I think that for the moment there isn't a huge kind of overlap from a research point of view, certainly between the fields, as far as I'm aware. There are quite a few articles and books on how notation can be used for preservation. And so there is some discussion of what you're preserving and the identity of the text, and not from a kind of directly translation point of view. There's going to be a volume coming out next year, I think, around dance, music and text that I've contributed a chapter to on this. And I think there'll be some other similar papers, not so much on notation, but on a sort of intersemiotic translation through dance. So I think it's beginning to sort of open up a little bit. A lot of the research, I think, although I'm not a great expert in this, in audio description, as I was saying, because you have to decide which, because then your sort of room for maneuver, as it were, is even more limited. That you're having so many aspects to describe, to fit in amongst the dialogue of a audiovisual product. And so whether movement is actually, apart from just saying, you know, he's walking across the garden or something, but whether the expressive quality of the movement needs or can be translated, what we read into this, or people's physical appearance. And I think there are some interesting experiments that I'm sure we've all seen in the last few years of sort of colorblind casting in films, and how modern adaptations, there's one, an Armando Iannucci film of David Copperfield, where the characters are cast black, white, mixed race actors, regardless of obviously what they would have been at the time or as Dickens intended them to be. And we've all seen the more sort of popular TV series like Bridgerton, which are beginning to introduce. So it's a form of translation where the body and the sort of physical element is being integrated in new ways. And so I think that there is some sort of exciting research that can be done around the topic in general.
Thank you, Mary. Please let us know when the book is out. I would be so happy to read it. So I'm sure we will stay in touch for future, and so can be also the other colleagues who are watching us online. If there are no other questions, yeah, we have a comment from Jan Pedersen. Yeah, I felt the same when I was asking mine. But really, as Mary said, there is so much potential, because I think all of us are already thinking, and our minds are racing, because you revealed really almost the whole new world to us. So thank you for that. Jan Pedersen is thanking you for that as well. But I'm sure so are the others. So if there are no more questions, I would like to thank all the three speakers from this parallel session, and now we will have a break until 2 o'clock, and we are going to continue with our very exciting discussion panel. So please follow us. I think it's going to be absolutely great. Thank you very much. Thank you and enjoy the rest of the day. Goodbye.